All right. Hi, I'm Evan Sachs from the Washington Heights-Inwood Mask Block, and I am here today with Anna Pakman, who is just an absolutely wonderful COVID-smart filmmaker who recently finished an Easter Seals film precisely about somebody with long COVID. Do you want to introduce yourself and talk about the film for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me, Evan. Well, I love masks, so thank you for all you do. So I am a filmmaker. I'm also a disability advocate. I've been a disability advocate for almost my whole life. I was born with something called cerebral palsy, which also makes me high risk for COVID complications. So I take precautions in my everyday life. Also, just knowing that post-COVID conditions and long COVID can impact anyone, even if they are currently healthy and don't have pre-existing conditions. For me, it's just incredibly important when working on films in person to create safe sets, both so that other people with disabilities can participate, it's an accommodation, as well as for everyone else, whether they know it or not, to protect everyone. Because when we create these accommodations for ourselves as disabled people, it also benefits the non-disabled people in the room or the not yet disabled people in the room because truly COVID can disable everyone. And disability, we like to say is the only club that people can join at any time in their lives. I was just likely to be born with it. For some people, it's Maybelline.
Yeah, oh my God, that is so true. I have taken to saying, like, hey, we're all vulnerable, whether we realize it or not. Yeah, that's something that I hope to get more people to realize is that some of us are more vulnerable than others, but we're all vulnerable. So thank you for getting out that message. And so I know the film that you recently made that is coming out tomorrow as of the time of recording, but it will likely already be out by the time this goes out it will come out on April 4th, right?
Yeah, so the film was released, or, if we're talking about present day, will be released on April 4th. It's funny because the film does have, spoiler alert, a little bit of a time traveler in it. So it's like perfect, thinking about like what day is today. Um, but yeah, so it's going to be available on the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge Facebook page as well as their YouTube challenge, their YouTube page. And yeah, I'm really excited for everyone to see it.
That's so amazing. And yeah, I hadn't realized until I saw you posting on Facebook about it that Easter Seals even had a film challenge. Like, how did you learn about it? And can you tell us more about what that challenge is?
Absolutely. So the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge is in its lucky 13th year. It was started by an actor slash comedian out in LA, Nick Novicki. So shout out to Nick, who himself is a little person and started the challenge because he is an actor in Hollywood. He's actually, been on a lot of major shows like Boardwalk Empire. But he was finding that he wasn't getting cast for the types of roles he was potentially interested in. So he decided to start making his own content, and he thought, you know what, why aren't other disabled people doing this? Because, we just need more representation of people with all kinds of disabilities in entertainment and media. It's still, there's been a lot of progress over the past few years, actually, but it's still very much lacking where it should be compared to, the prevalence of disability in our population is actually 25% according to the CDC, but not anywhere near 25% of people you see in the media represent that. So, Nick has been really hustling, working hard for the past 13 years to grow this challenge. And, now there are teams all over the world making 5-minute films in 5 days. So it's really tough because we have just 5 days from start to finish, like, from just starting production to actually having a fully edited, sound mixed film that's out there in the world. And that all happens in just 5 days. And the films have to be 5 minutes or under, which is another challenge because, it's really hard, as I found over the years, to tell a fully formed story in just 5 minutes. And so, it's one of those things where you kind of have to be quick about it, and you have to, really decide what to focus on because you can't tell, especially with something as complex as like long COVID. Like it's just impossible to tell like the story of long COVID in 5 minutes. But it's not, the film is not about long COVID. It features, I like to say, it features a character who's living with long COVID, and that's the way I approach disability-centered film too. Like we're all, first and foremost human. So it's just about this very human experience and the longing for connection that this character has, that's told in some pretty, dramatic, but also some very funny ways because we're doing dramedy this year. And that's part of the film challenge too, is every year we are assigned a genre. So this year we were assigned dramedy. But I think it's so perfect too because like the pandemic was such a major global event that impacted literally everyone in the world in different ways. And, I think we all, in our own ways, are still dealing with the trauma from that. But, with a lot of times with these types of things, is like you can choose just to cry, but you can also laugh about it. Like I think there are some funny things. So, I actually got involved with the film challenge. I made my first film 7 years ago when the pandemic started. So 2020 was the first year I participated. That year it was a documentary, Do It Yourself from Home. And it was kind of perfect for me as a pandemic hobby because I just am not very good at baking bread. So I never got into the whole bread thing. And filmmaking became my pandemic hobby. And so I got really hooked. It's something I had been wanting to do, actually way before COVID, but life just kind of kept getting in the way. The dates didn't work for me. I had other stuff going on, but in 2020, let's be real, like we all didn't have other stuff going on, so it was perfect timing. So I've been doing it ever since, and just really love filmmaking and love all the friends that I've met through the challenge as well.
Oh, that is so amazing. And I love that as a pandemic hobby, as somebody who used to be a film editor and is now a copy editor instead. But I am all for making and editing films as a hobby. But um, yeah, like I think that's like particularly great what you mentioned about dramedy and jokes and such, especially because I find, not that I'm always good at it, that oftentimes humor can help people like latch onto a concept that they otherwise might struggle with. Have you found that at all helpful in your filmmaking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly for this, we were very particular about crafting the story, just knowing that, I think the audience, like our people who, mask, I'm so excited to share it with like the COVIDing community because we've had zero representation. There's been a media blackout, and we have a character now who masks for about 50% of the film. People with long COVID really haven't been represented, in film or television. So I think like the representation alone is so important. And I think, well, definitely there's an audience for that. But I think the broader audience and the chance to, with the film challenge, it's such a big platform under Easter Seals that it's a chance to speak to a broader audience. And I'm just going to be very real. Like people don't want to hear the word COVID. It's the third rail. Hollywood is not doing anything with it. And it's kind of was the way with like September 11th. It took a while for some of those projects to start rolling out because it was such a sensitive topic area. So I think, like I joke about it as being something that we have to be kind of really methodical about, and almost like getting a kid to eat their broccoli or spinach. You put the spinach in a brownie. And comedy is the brownie that helps people see like, oh, this is actually, it's not necessarily like COVID, 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 but it is a story about someone who was particularly impacted by the pandemic, by COVID. And but there's a bigger theme there. There's the theme of like just wanting connection. There's the theme of loneliness, which I feel like, beyond, the COVID community, there's a loneliness epidemic, in the country and the world. And just, it's really about found family and those topics that I think everyone can relate to, whether they mask, they don't mask. Like, even I think some of the biggest anti-vaxxers like would probably be like, oh, actually, there's something fun and interesting here. Because, it's just something that I think comedy helps unite people, even if you don't agree with the topic or the message. I think we could all just laugh at things that are funny. And for me personally, I just love doing comedy because I'm a comedy writer. So before I, started making my own films, I've been writing scripts for a very long time and just been dreaming about like, oh, it'd be so cool if like one day something I wrote was made into a movie. And like now I'm doing it, which is just such a dream come true.
Oh, that is so wonderful to hear. And yeah, what you said about like we're all dealing with a loneliness epidemic, or at least a lot of us are. And goodness knows, even as somebody who, fingers crossed, doesn't currently have long COVID, but I don't want to get it. I don't want to give it to somebody else. It can feel really isolating sometimes to sometimes feel like I am the only one masking, the only one in a room acknowledging that, yeah, the pandemic is now. This isn't an epidemic. This is still a pandemic, and yeah, that can feel very lonely sometimes. Have you found any ways to combat that loneliness yourself, or seen ways other people have combated that loneliness?
Yeah, I think I'm at a point in time in my life where like I'm maybe like an internal old person because I'm like, I just don't care like what other people think about it. At the end of the day, I just really value my health. And I absolutely love not getting sick as much as I used to before COVID. Which is great because like it lets me do so many more things in my life. Um, and I think people in general just also appreciate not being sick, but don't always have the tools to kind of deal with the social pressure. In the same way, I'm also very, very, very fortunate in that I have a strong support network. My mom, who I'm very close to, also is COVID cautious and masks. I have, several friends. My best friend, actually, she's not part of any of the online communities, but she's someone who still, like, to this day masks. And Yeah, I've made, several close friends who, also mask, but I'm also lucky in that those friends, my friends before COVID, or even friends I've made during the pandemic, because I made friends during the pandemic who are not COVID cautious. I think it's just like a mutual respect of, um, it's kind of like they understand why I do it, and they support me when we're together. But maybe I don't agree with their decision, but I appreciate what they do, to accommodate me when we're together. And it's just you have to understand that like you can't control what you can't control, which also like doesn't really, impact me. Like, of course, I would, love for them not to be sick, but they can make their own choices. They're adults.
Yeah, and that's a big thing, as somebody, like I'm a New York atheist Jew, like I've being a Spitfire is in my blood, I like to say, but you know, um saying like, hey, right, like I can't control what you do when you're not around me, but like, will you do XYZ when you are around me? Like that makes such a big difference to me, at least, where, I have to remind myself all the time, like, I can't control what they do when they're over there, but it is so important to say like, hey, like even if I can't control what they're doing in their day-to-day life, if they're willing to do certain things when they're around me, that's some level of harm reduction, even if, we wish we could be like, hey, everybody do the right thing all the time. And is there any way you found that is particularly helpful for talking to people about like, hey, at least when you're around me or an X or Y situation, can you mask or can you put on an air purifier, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think just open communication does a world of, good in interpersonal relationships. I just try to be very clear, like, hey, here's, my boundaries right now, and here's what I need. So, for example, like just, socializing, like I won't eat indoors, I will only eat outdoors. And so all of my friends know that like if it's raining that day, we'll just have to reschedule and it's fine. But it's also reciprocal. I mean, I have friends who are gluten-free or vegans, and I'm not. Like I love meat, I love pasta. Real pasta, sorry, gluten-free folks. But if I'm with them, of course, like I'll go to a vegan restaurant gladly. I'll go to a gluten-free restaurant or like be also just mindful of like if I'm picking where we go, which actually often happens because I also have a physical disability. And I use a wheelchair, so everyone's like usually like, oh, I don't want to deal with figuring this out. Like you pick, which is fine. And I it's also something that I know, like reciprocally, like, I think it's just part of like building and having a relationship is that if you know, like, that's what that person's boundaries are, like, you're a good friend if you respect them. And I've also found that, it's interesting, like with these film projects, one of the things I do, so we do film in person, and I create COVID safer sets, which to me means it's a set of precautions that works for the context of the project. And so those precautions, they flex depending on where we're filming, what the scene is, who's in the room, the needs of, particularly the actors, because there are lots of like situations where, actors in particular, for certain scenes, can't be masked themselves. Um, and that also is like a little bit of a flexible like moving target depending on the role. And part of like when I was casting this film, there is one character who absolutely cannot be masked. And that's because she's a medieval ghost. It would be pretty silly like for her to be masked as a medieval ghost. And when I was casting, that's also something just, just radical disclosure I think is really important of like, of course, like I welcome everyone, but just so you know, like, here's what we can do. Like, we can 100% like protect you on like the clothes set, which was in my apartment. But there might be a situation where we are in a public place and I just can't control what the public does in said public place. But for the sets, when we had 2 days that we were shooting. One, we were shooting entirely indoors. And one of the spaces was actually a doctor's office, and that doctor's office is one of those rare medical facilities that still requires masks themselves. So that's very easy too, because I could just point to their sign and be like, hey, it's not me. They want us to mask. And everyone was just so respectful. But also like it's an upfront, thing that I put in. So when people were, I had to form the people when they were volunteering. So these are all volunteer projects. When they were volunteering, it was a point that I had people check off of like, they knew that there would be masking involved. They knew that there would be testing for COVID involved. And so that's very helpful in that it lets people, like, if someone has like a serious problem with that, that's fine. That's, they're entitled to that position. But they know that this is not going to be a good project for them to volunteer for. And so they won't. And so I won't have to deal with that. And so, we were lucky to have just an amazing cast and crew. And everyone was just super chill about it. I also was very lucky to be sponsored by Aptitude Medical, the producers of the metrics test system. And so they sent me a box of their new Generation 2 COVID tests, actually COVID and flu tests. So, I mean, I wasn't going to kick anyone out for flu, but as a bonus, also really kind of don't want the flu. But it was great because I've been using their Generation 1 tests before. Like they've been just great partners in these productions, which are just, like there's really no budget in these productions. I pay for them out of pocket. Like I'm not independently wealthy. So having that support is huge because the test alone would have been like $1,000 out of pocket. And so on the indoor day, we took those tests and it just provides like so much peace of mind, but also like we follow the science. So we know, look, if we've tested, and in addition to that metrics test, we also, everyone on set is required to do a rapid test at home the day before. So we're not just relying on one test. We have, serial testing. And looking at the statistics, the metrics test, for those not familiar with them, they're more like PCRs. So they have a really high degree of accuracy. And so, again, realizing that a lot of listeners here are themselves COVID cautious. I know that as COVID cautious folks, we have different levels. We're all in different places, and that's okay. My personal level that I'm comfortable with is with something like a metrics or a plus life, those molecular tests. I'm okay if people unmask indoors, but I also can keep my mask on and I choose to. If there are other people who want to or need to mask just so they don't feel alone, kind of going back to that topic, even, if I'm personally comfortable as like, the leader in the room, like I think it's important for leadership, particularly if there are, events that are disability centered or mask required. It's hard to get other people on board if you're not doing it yourself. And something kind of incredible happened because I said that day, like, hey, the doctor's office, they have their own mask requirements, so we have to abide by that. My apartment, it was a community agreement with the actors, the particular actors who were involved. Also had, similar, precaution, safety, comfort levels to me, and didn't feel that it was necessary to have a mask requirement indoors. But I feel like probably because I kept mine on, almost every single crew member was masked the whole day. And this was a long day. I mean, I think this was like 13, 14 hours of masking. Except for like we did eat lunch and dinner, but also like it provides the flexibility of like if folks want to, eat, indoors or it's like they don't love the weather that day, that's fine. We've all tested with these really great accurate tests, and those tests facilitate being able to do that. And for those who, prefer to eat outdoors or need to eat outdoors, I just made sure that like outdoor dining space was available. And we were lucky with the weather too, in that like every single person actually was like, no, I'm gonna eat lunch outdoors. So we all, were eating outdoors together. Which I think, is really great. And then our second day of our shoot, we were even luckier with the weather. We were filming on that perfect 70-degree day, in Central Park the whole day. And just being outdoors the whole day, to me, that's like a different safety calculation. So we just used regular um rapid test on that day as well. But again, everyone tested into set. And for the actors, because they were in each other's faces the whole day, like they did the metrics test again, just to be sure. So it was something that, I put a lot of thought into. And I created just a guide to set that included all of this information. And I had to do zero enforcement basically, and it was great. Like everyone was on the same page. So I think it just kind of goes back to communication and just also, like being reasonable. I think where people kind of like start opposing some of this stuff is when it kind of crosses a line where I'm like, okay. I know we're all going to be working really hard for 13 hours. I can't like have a strict requirement where no one can eat or drink. Like that's just not going to be reasonable. So I think it's like, what are those like bounds of reason and what are the tools between testing and, masking? What are the tools we can realistically apply? And I mean, of course, we had other things too. Like I had my shout out to the torches, the New Kid torches. I had the torches running. So we had UV. I had in between takes, the HEPA filters on high. Unfortunately, like for anyone not familiar with production, you kind of have to turn them off because the sound messes things up. You can't keep the windows open because the sound messes up. But in between takes, like we would just there was like a PA whose job it was to open and close the window. So I think, it's hard, like it might be hard to do this on like completely 100% strict precautions, but I think it's also about compromise and thankfully, knock on wood, no one got sick.
Yeah, and like that to me, that's such an amazing example of like, okay, we can't be perfect, but we're gonna use that Swiss cheese model of layering up our precautions. We're gonna test, we're gonna open the windows when we can, we're gonna have our air purifiers, air filters when we can. And like that's so important. That layering is just so important of like, okay, like no one layer is going to be perfect, or even you're not necessarily going to be able to have it the whole time. So that's why you do these layered approaches. And so that's like so wonderful to hear. And, you mentioned the metrics tests, which I have come to love. But as you mentioned, they're like, I think the Just COVID ones are something like $24, give or take a pop. And add to that the reader, which is thankfully a one-time purchase for most of us, but it can get expensive for a lot of people. So that's really wonderful that that Aptitude sponsored you. Um, yeah, and I think you mentioned when we were talking on Facebook that it was really important to you to have somebody as the lead who has long COVID themselves. Can you talk about that casting process, what you had in mind, etc.?
Yeah, so I think in addition to being a filmmaker myself, like I my particular area of disability advocacy for a long time because I used to work in the TV industry on the marketing side for a while and have done a lot of advocacy work both when I was working there and even before because just growing up with a physical disability, there was no representation. I really didn't see anyone like myself in, TV or movies in an authentic way. I mean, I saw famous actors winning Oscars for using disability as a costume, but I think we know in so many other communities that is wrong, and it's equally wrong to do it with disability. And so authentic casting is very important to me. And also just that idea of like not cripping up. And I think the thing with long COVID too, even, within the community, I think it's just important to keep in mind. Is that it looks different on everyone. It's a disability that can have literally 200, different symptoms. Iterations can be, from someone who you would never know just by looking at them. You would never know in their mannerisms. But like there are definitely health challenges there, to someone who looks very disabled. And to me, like that was always going to depend on who ended up being in the role. So, to me, it's like very important that like we don't crip up, like we don't, put someone in, large headphones just because some people have, sensory, disabilities related to it. If that's not, that person's lived experience that we don't, make someone walk with a cane or put them in a wheelchair if that's not how they get around because to the audience, particularly to disabled audience members and a lot of there's a lot of cross disability audience for the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge. And the disability community, first of all, it's offensive, but also like people are going to clock that right away. Like if someone who's not used to doing that every day, if all of a sudden you shove them in a chair, you put them like a stick in their hands, like they're just not going to know what to do with it in the way that, someone who has that lived experience. So I mean, I think definitely casting is was a process for this, and it was a harder process than it's been in the past. And that's just because, just being very real here, of the reality and the nature of film production, particularly, on a production where we don't get to control a lot of it. So with the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge, it has to be done in 5 days. There's a really, hard deadline that like I have no control over. Like as a filmmaker, we can't move. It's done with volunteer crews. We're not allowed to pay people. And so our access to our crew is very limited in our ability to kind of, say to people like, hey, we can't get people, like it's doable for one day for sure. It's doable for 2 days maybe, but 3 days it's like a really big ask for someone to work unpaid. So we have such limited access to our crew, and that's why we have such long days. And the realities, and that is like long days, by the way, are just like very typical of the industry and professional productions. If you're working on a, shoot most of the time, that shoot, it's going to be like 13, 14 hours is pretty standard. Unfortunately, the reality of that also is that doesn't jive with a lot of folks' disability needs when there are fatigue issues or, just a limited energy, which is typical of a lot of folks who actually have long COVID. There also were, it's the issue of as a person, as a human being in the pandemic, I love masks. As a director, masks are hard. Like I'll be very honest. Masking actors and like if you go to theater, for example, even when you go to like a safer show, I've been to, I don't think I've seen a single show that has masked their actors. Even people who are making theater themselves who are COVID cautious and have strict, like, I've been to shows that have strict respirator requirements, which I love as an audience member. But that is so that the performers are able to be more safely unmasked on stage. So as a director, generally speaking, and there have been times where I have wanted to have a masked character, and it's rare that you have an actor who can really pull it off. Because masks they do it at times, like in this specific context, they mask, the actor's ability to fully use their face to portray emotion. And so that becomes very difficult. And there's a pivotal scene in this film that happens outdoors, that happens in the park, that it was important to me that the actor be unmasked, that is playing the person with long COVID. I could say her name. The character's name is Christina, because by now the film will be out. And so Christina, and it's very important that she feels safe with this other person, Wilhelmina, who's the medieval ghost that she accidentally summons in the film. And it is that sort of really strong symbol of intimacy of her taking off the mask and, just staying unmasked of her. And going back to the concept of, safety and perception of safety being personal to each of us. For me, I don't mask outdoors in the park. So for me, like if I was the person in that scene, I would feel perfectly fine. The actress, Mackenzie, who is just an incredible actress. Shout out to Mackenzie Morgan Gomez. Just such an incredible performer. It's actually her first short film. So super excited for everyone just to see how incredibly talented she is. And her level of comfort is similar to mine, so that worked out. But there were people that I talked to in the casting process where, just because, like, Central Park, where we were filming, is a public park, I had to say, like, look, like, we'll be outdoors, but I can't stop, Karen from down the street from walking by this bench. It's just not something within our control. And so, like, you kind of have to be okay with that. And there are people who, that didn't fit their level of precautions, and that's fine. But we were so lucky, to end up with Mackenzie, and she's so talented. We, also had someone else actually, it's interesting the process for this lined up to play the lead role who does identify as someone with long COVID, but she had to drop out last minute. And so, Mackenzie stepping in, Mackenzie, is not diagnosed with long COVID, but has chronic illness that started after a COVID infection. So, and that's also a very common thing, I will say, is, particularly with this, illness is not everyone gets like that official diagnosis. And although a lot of, depending on what source you look at, the definition, like the official definition of long COVID, or sometimes it's called post-COVID, which I feel is like more inclusive, as it incorporates, just the reality that more people are facing, um, includes anyone who's had like any kind of ongoing symptoms that haven't resolved 6 months after an infection. Um, And so, by that definition, like myself, unfortunately, have had, post-COVID complications. Um, and it's just, like any disability, like I have my primary disability is CP. Like any disability, there's a spectrum. So there are people with my disability who are in the Paralympics, and if you look at them, you'd be like, that person has CP, really? And then there are people who can't walk, can't talk, are on a feeding tube, and have it really, really, severe, and like one is not more valid than the other. And so there's like, I think especially like with invisible disabilities, a big thing that I hear from my peers who have, non-visible disabilities is just, and sometimes it happens even in circles of people who have some of these disabilities too, is being made to feel like their disability is not enough. And just so for me in this film, it was just really important to make sure that everyone felt seen and that, there are some disabilities that are not visible. Mackenzie's disability in the film is her disability in real life. Visibly, it's dynamic. There are some scenes where she's hopping out of bed and walking unassisted because that's what she can do at home. And so when she's in, the character's home, she can do that. But in the park, she uses a cane because that's the way she would show up at the park. So I think it's just kind of, as a writer, as a director, something that I like to do is just kind of like not, you have to be flexible and you have to just accept that there's not one truth, but you have to accept, the truth of eventually whatever is going to fit the story and whoever is going to play the role.
Yeah, that really is important to me too, or special to me too, as somebody who only sporadically needs to use a cane. Like,
Mhm.
thankfully, very rarely these days, but I used to need it to use it a lot more often. But most people can't see that I have any kind of disability or immune condition in day-to-day life because 90% of the time I don't need mobility aids. And that doesn't mean that I don't have what I have.
Yeah.
And to what you said earlier, having somebody who can really authentically use in this instance a mobility aid, like a cane, because I know for me, like, the way I use my cane when I need it, it's not like what it looks in the movie is, and it's probably gonna be a lot more smooth and a lot faster than how it's often portrayed in Hollywood, but yeah, you also mentioned that, like, acting through a mask, which, uh, for me, like, I often, like, throw up in my hands and say, like, oh my goodness, like, clearly some people have never had theater training because they can't enunciate, they can't use their diaphragm, and, is oftentimes, like, that's again the New York Jew in me, but yeah, do you have advice for people who, like, you know be it for acting through a mask, be it like how to, like, really use your diaphragm and enunciate and, like, use expression in your eyes to get through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny because like it just depends on the person. I was just so fortunate to work with Mackenzie, who is fantastic at both of those things. Like she has very expressive eyes, and I think just practicing like that. I also like I would say like the type of mask helps. So I had her wearing, I gave her like prop masks. They're real masks. I mean, they're real like KF94 masks, and I just can't recall the name. But they're really these very sleek, slim cut Korean masks that I happen to have, and they don't fit that great on me, but they were perfect for her face, and they were perfect for the film because they have like they're thin, they have a smaller profile. So I think also being flexible about the type of mask, I think it's a lot easier to act in like one of those, or like my other go-to if that hadn't been such a good fit for her would have been a Mask C, because they're cool, like they have nice designs and they're pretty, slim profile. But I think with something like an aura, which she does wear actually in the first scene because she's in a doctor's office, and we also see that being dynamic too, because like as maskers, like I don't wear the same mask for a doctor's appointment as I would outdoors or as I would like, walking, out, just taking the elevator downstairs in my apartment building. So it just, also we see that that's dynamic too, that the level, of risk and, it's a constant calculation. Even though like in 5 minutes we can't like have a whole dialogue about that, but it's a small visual cue that hopefully like at least people in our community I think will get. And who knows, I might see some comments on the videos being like, why did she change her mask? But so I think that helps. With the diaphragm, Mackenzie is a trained theater actor. And the theater actors tend to be just really good at projecting. So that's like my note to me. Although, like, I had, another actor 2 years ago that was going to be in a role that's originally masked. She's not COVID cautious. One of my dear friends, extremely talented. Love you, Teresa. But I just wasn't feeling it with the mask on, so we had her take it off. And again, it was like one of those things where that was, she's not someone who's taking precautions in her everyday life, but still like for that, like we shot in a store that we were able to leave the door open. And so, it's not all or nothing. But yeah, I mean, as a director, it's hard. Like directors in general don't like to mask their characters. And also, I mean, I just think it lent itself to this role as well. Like it might have been like a harder choice if it was just an average character who wasn't necessarily COVID cautious, but because, we wanted to show she's taking precautions, it made sense.
Yeah, and I think I saw Teresa in a clip of the trailer you showed me for this film. Did I spot that correctly?
Yeah,
Or
so Teresa did have a cameo in this film. She's awesome. She's very fun. So it's always a good time to have her on set.
yeah, and yeah, I've been in like an extra with her in like one or two other indie films. And she's truly a delight,
Oh,
and
that's wild that you know each other. Yeah, she's my dear friend from high school.
I love it. But yeah, like, and that's actually an interesting other topic of conversation. How do you work with actors and crew members who might not otherwise be COVID smart, COVID cautious in their day-to-day life outside of the films that you're doing with them?
Well, I think again, it just comes down to communication. Like if someone is strongly opposed to taking precautions, like this is definitely not going to be the right fit for them, and that's okay. I think this is a space where people are kind of accustomed to like, either this is for you or not for you. Not every production is going to be for every person, and that's fine. But generally, like, I mean, first of all, I work with a lot of my friends, which is always so much fun. So they already know, and they're gonna know, like, just you're not gonna cross my threshold without a mask on if you're not tested. So there's that. But yeah, no, I mean, I just find everyone is like so respectful, and just having a clear set of precautions, so everyone kind of knows up front, like this is what it is, and no one's left guessing. And then having, just the consistency around it. But mainly in production, I rely on tests strongly more than anything. Particularly, and with actors, it's also just like less contentious just because they can't be masked anyway for when they're on camera. So it's half one, half the other. Of course, there's like harm reduction, but if someone is like shooting for 5 hours, like what's the point of them being like masked for 15 minutes? That's just not going to do much either way. So that's why we use testing more than masking as our primary precaution.
Oh, I feel that struggle, and yeah, like we were saying earlier, that layered approach of like, hey, if you can't do one, do the other, and do as many as you can at one time, but you're not going to be able to do them all at one time, right?
Yeah, and also for the people who are going to yell at me, by the way, like everyone is absolutely masked with a respirator before the test results are in. So it doesn't just because like once you get the result from like the PCR level test, we're like, okay, you can unmask now. Everyone, the minute they walk in the door, while they're waiting for the results, everyone is like masked, and I have masks for everyone on site. I think that's another thing too, is just providing the supplies. Like it just is, people might not think of a simple thing, but like people who are not COVID cautious, like they're not trying to be assholes, but they just don't have this stuff anymore. They
Right.
don't have it lying around their house. It just, I try to make it very easy for them, like before production, I'm like, do you have tests? You don't have tests? Okay, cool. I'm gonna Uber Eats you a test. I'm gonna send it to you from Amazon. I'm gonna, whatever method, like, can you come to my house, pick it up? However, I need to get it to them. I just make sure they know like this is going to be seamless, this is going to be easy. They're not going to be out like, because also I don't know everyone's situation. Even $20, even $10 can be a lot for someone. So I'm just like, you don't have to worry about that. I'll give you the mask, I'll give you the test, just please use it. So again, like I've been fortunate to work with people who um just really get it. And I think that's also the nature of film production too. Like sets tend to be very hierarchical. And so like if the director is telling you to do something, you're gonna do it.
Yes, oh my gosh. And yeah, thank you for, pointing out like, yeah, wear a respirator until you get that negative result. Well, fingers crossed negative.
Yeah.
Which like, it hadn't even occurred to me. Like I was assuming you were doing that, but yeah, please everybody please don't yell at Anna. She's being smart. So yeah, and you bring up a good point that I think you brought up a little bit earlier as well of like because of that hierarchical nature, if the example and the request is coming from leadership, it makes a big difference. And yeah, could you talk a bit more to like that social pressure and that like setting the importance of that setting that example, whether you're on set or elsewhere, because I know it can be a big deal, just having that social cue there.
Yeah, and and that's why I also like a lot of times like that's why I do my own productions is like, when you do your own project, you're the boss. And so you get to so I like at minimum, set is always going to be based on my precautions. I say at minimum because like again, if there's like someone who needs an accommodation, like I'm a big believer in accommodations as long, as they're reasonable. Like, there are certain things that we can do and there are certain things that we can't, like the conversation we just had about like the bench. Like I can't stop random people from walking by a bench in a public space. So just being very real about that not being a possible accommodation, but like I can make the crew masks around you, sure, no problem. Even if we're outdoors, like I can ask them if they're within like 6 feet of you to put on a mask. That's something I can absolutely do. But controlling like every tourist that happens to walk by it, like I wish I could, but I can't. But I have also been on the flip side, on other projects and other scenarios where it just hasn't been the same where, I've asked for like, hey, can like people mask? Like, I remember there was one time like I was invited to just be a PA on one set and as a volunteer too. So I'm like, okay, you're asking me to volunteer to do this, but can like the crew at least just like, can we all just wear masks because it was winter, it was indoors. And in a like in a closed set, not like, one of those like in a museum, for example, you can't get everyone to mask. I understand that. Um, but can we just like have a mask requirement because the rates are high? And they were like, well, no. I'm like, okay, well then I'm not going to volunteer on your set because A, like I don't really have to do this. And B, it's just not within like my current precautions at the time. So, and that's where, I think it's a big privilege that, I'm able to do this because then I'm able to kind of create the environment I want to see.
Oh yeah, that's so amazing. And hey, yeah, I've heard so many people and like I've turned down projects as well where I know at one point like a couple years ago, had a wonderful opportunity to, do some outdoor Shakespeare with some with Actors Shakespeare Company, which is at a New York and New Jersey based theater company that like I've literally, known some of the people there since I was like 10 years old, so like two-thirds of my life at this point plus. And like so did this wonderful thing on Shakespeare's birthday a couple of years ago where we were all outside. So and so it was like, okay, yeah, great, perfect. We're all outside. Like I'm similar to you where it's like if it's outdoors where I can space out from people, I'll unmask. You know, and unfortunately, like I was talking to one of the folks who was directing that particular, Shakespeare scenes in the park kind of thing, and she needed somebody to play Caliban in a production of The Tempest, and I was saying like, well, like for my precautions, like I would love to fill in this role for you, because we'd been rehearsing, so she'd gotten to see me like do my monologues and yada yada, and so we were like, okay, like I could fill this role, but unfortunately, that was going to be indoors, and she felt she couldn't, require the audience to mask and yada yada, and I always find it very strange to say, so often I hear people say, like, well, like, now that there isn't like a state or federal requirement, I can't require people to mask, even though it's going to be for my production or whatnot. Have you ever encountered that before, and how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I'm here in my personal capacity, but I also work for the state tourism um, agency, and I can tell you absolutely that's not true. Um, so, I mean, but what you're saying, I think, is true. What I'm saying is not true is that there is nothing prohibiting anyone. So, PSA, nothing prohibiting. If you're putting on an event, you're a business owner in the state, you have every right to have a mask requirement, have a test requirement, whatever you want. The only thing is, you can never do less than what the state or federal government is requiring. So let's say if the state had a mask mandate, you can't like not have a mask mandate. But if the state doesn't have a mask mandate, it's kind of like everyone is like YOLOing. So you could do, you don't have to do it, but like if you want to, you can. It's like your private business, it's your business. But just, understanding also like the various, there are situations, rare situations, where someone because of a disability can't wear a mask. You do have to have like alternate accommodations in those situations. And so anyone who is watching this and is like, oh, but I was told like I'm not allowed to do it. No, that's not true. Like, absolutely, you are allowed to do it. You're allowed to require masks, but and I've also like done a lot of advocacy in theater, in terms of, just audience masking for shows, and been somewhat successful with off-Broadway theaters. The pushback that I've been hearing lately, and that I've seen personally when I've gone to some of these performances, is there tend to be like a few contingents of the audience that sometimes just make it unpleasant for the people who are working front of house because there's people like us who will show up in our N95s and be very happy about this like mask requirement and be like, rah, 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 can I take a photo of you with your mask sign? This is so cool. Love this. Thank you for doing this. On the other hand, there are people who go through their lives just being oblivious to what they're doing. And part of that obliviousness is like they end up buying tickets to mask required performances without realizing that's what they're doing. And then they show up, and 90% of the people that this happens to are like, oh, I have to wear a mask? Oh, can you give me a mask? Oh, okay, fine. And they do it. No problem. 10% um, become a problem, in that they're like, oh, like they don't understand it, why they have to do it because what they see, like, the inputs they see societally. And that's also why, like, I would say also, I think we have to understand that the lack of precautions is less an individual issue, although people have free will. And of course, everyone's responsible for their actions, but also societal issues because, like, the people who are not doing it, they're getting all these signals from the government from just walking around outside and seeing people unmasked, walking around inside, seeing a lot of people, all these people unmasked. And that, like, mentally for them registers like must be okay because, like, look, I'm in a theater full of people, 1,000 people are not dead. They're right here. They're sitting next to me. They're not dead. So therefore, it doesn't seem like a big deal to them. Um, I think that what then ends up happening, is like the 10% of people who, in any situation, and these are the people who just like anyone who's worked in customer service will tell you, make themselves a nuisance wherever they go. They make themselves a nuisance. They give the people enforcing the mandate, a hard time. And I think, part of it is, the theaters could better communicate why. Some of them do a really good job. Shout out to Allison Cobb and Allison, if you're listening. Allison's an amazing Axis dramaturg, who's been working with some shows. And like, I've noticed that the shows that, Allison works on, have this really great message usually included in the program somewhere, about, masking being communicated and being something that's needed so that people who otherwise couldn't attend performances because of their disabilities are able to do so. And I think, with my productions, making that understood up front, everyone's on board 100%. Because like at the end of the day, I think like you go from like the 10% of people, it's only 1% of people who would like actively want to harm anyone, like the sociopaths. And they will definitely be the ones to show up to the mask required show, like no doubt. But they're such a minority where like I think then you could get the 90% of the 10% down if those messages were not like put inside a program, but were somehow like more prominent up front. And like I think it's just about the communications. And again, sometimes it's hard, like the theater, a lot of sales happen third party. The third parties don't always like carry forth. Even the idea of like, okay, maybe you go to the public and they have their calendar says mask required, and then Today Tix doesn't make that clear when they sell the tickets on Today Tix. So that becomes a huge problem of communication. So I think just being a marketing person, being like a digital communications person, just you have to be so meticulous about making sure that every touch point, that message is super clear. And also the why. The why are we doing this? Because the biggest thing, the people who are complaining, they don't get why they're being asked to do this. They're like, this is silly. The pandemic's over. Why are you asking me to mask? But they don't understand that like maybe the person next to them like is immunocompromised and that's their only opportunity out of like the thousands of events in the city. That's the only one that they can go to. And I think, I wish that I could be seated next to them in each of those instances because like I have like also volunteered myself out. Like I need to volunteer myself out to more productions. Like I would happily just for free go there and be an enforcer and like 10% would be fine. The 1% of sociopaths would just go home crying if they had to talk to me about it.
Yes, this is why we need more people who are like experienced in like customer service, whether that's front of house theater or like working food service or, retail, some of us are used to being mean when it comes to that 10%. So, yes, thank you. And Allison, was it?
Yeah,
Who,
Allison Cobbett
yeah,
is amazing. Amazing
yeah.
dramaturg.
Yeah, big shout out to Allison Cobb. Yay, definitely going to look Allison up after this. Um, but that's so amazing. So big shout out to people like that. And yeah, that is very important to like, smack it in people's faces because you're, like you said, you're always going to get those people who are just like spacing out when they get a ticket or whatever. That just won't notice the most honking of signs, but like, goodness knows I've seen so many instances where like that number is probably doubled because like it wasn't obvious on Today Tix or wherever,
Mhm.
but you also mentioned a couple times now, the importance of having and providing these resources to people, on set or at the theater or wherever else. And that's so important precisely because, whether it's just because the person is unaware or it can get expensive, like you said, tests can, get really pricey really quick. How have you found that, having those materials that you can give for people for free on set or wherever you are, how has that helped your production?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just makes it just, again, I think if you're asking someone to do something, you got to make it easy for them to do it. That's the bottom line. And that's how you get the best compliance is when you make it easy, that it's frictionless. Like no one has time to think about like, oh, here's my reasons for not doing this. There's really no reason. But it is, I just want to acknowledge too, like it's a privilege to be able to do this. It's a privilege to be sponsored by Aptitude because like I honestly would not have been able to afford like an extra $1,000 for those tests for this production. So it was huge that they were able to provide that.
Yeah, so big shout out to Aptitude, who are not sponsoring me, I promise. I'm just excited that they're sponsoring you. And thank you again so, so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close this out?
Yeah, just please, you can help us out. The Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge has an awareness competition alongside, just the filmmaking competition. And you can help us out by watching the film, smashing that like button. You can, and if you hate the film too, like there's different emojis. Every single emoji counts. Just smash the hate button. If you hate it, just smash the hate button. If you love it, smash the love button. Whatever reaction you have to it, just, interact with the video, and leave us a comment. We love comments. Just it's available on Facebook on the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge channel. It's also available on YouTube. Share it with all your friends, share it with all your enemies, share it with everyone who masks, share it with everyone you wish would mask. But yeah, the more views we get, the more interactions we get, it helps us in that competition. So just appreciate everyone.
Thank you again, and I will put Anna's socials and the film socials in the show notes so that you can go give Anna and the film some love. And thank you so, so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you so much as well. It was so great talking to you.